the scorching heat of 1858 Texas, when the line between civilization and wilderness was drawn in blood, one woman's desperate plea would challenge everything the Comanche warrior Standing Bear believed about mercy, honor, and the brutal code that governed life on the frontier. What happened next would be whispered around campfires for generations, a moment when humanity triumphed over hatred in the most unexpected way. The sun was merciless that day, beating down on the endless prairie where two worlds collided. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her final prayer would be answered by the very people she'd been taught to fear most. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, angels come in the most unlikely forms. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that God tested people in ways they could understand. As she knelt in the dirt, her hands bound behind her back with rawhide that cut into her wrists, she wondered if this was a test she was meant to fail. The morning had started like any other on their small homestead outside Fort Worth. She had been hanging laundry on the line, watching her 6-year-old daughter Emma chase butterflies through the wildflowers that grew near their cabin. The cotton sheets flapped gently in the warm breeze, and Sarah had paused to appreciate the simple beauty of the moment. Her husband Thomas was in the fields, and their older son James was helping him harvest the late summer corn. Life was hard on the frontier, but it was theirs. The attack came without warning. The first arrow struck the cabin door just as Sarah was reaching for another wet sheet. The second buried itself in the wooden post inches from her head. Emma's laughter turned to screams as painted warriors on horseback thundered into their peaceful morning like a nightmare made real. Sarah's training took over. Thomas had drilled it into her countless times. If the Comanche came, get to the root cellar, hide Emma, pray they passed by quickly. But as she grabbed her daughter and ran toward the cabin, she realized with growing horror that this wasn't a quick raid. There were too many of them, and they moved with the precision of hunters who had done this before. The cabin door exploded inward just as Sarah reached it. A tall warrior with intricate tattoos covering his chest stepped through the splintered wood, his dark eyes scanning the room with calculated efficiency. Behind him came others, their war paint still fresh, their weapons ready. Emma clung to Sarah's skirts, sobbing. Sarah pulled her daughter behind her, backing toward the far wall where Thomas kept his rifle. Her fingers found the wooden stock, but before she could lift it, a younger warrior was there, his hand clamping down on the barrel. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed, hoping against hope that her husband might hear, might come running with James. But even as she called out, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the fields. Her heart shattered as she understood that help wasn't coming. The tattooed warrior stepped closer. Up close, Sarah could see that he was older than the others, maybe 40, with scars that spoke of many battles. His presence commanded respect from the younger men, and Sarah realized he must be their leader. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, speaking in the Comanche language she didn't understand. One of the younger warriors replied, gesturing toward Emma. The girl was perhaps 6, small for her age, with blonde hair that caught the sunlight streaming through the cabin window. The leader studied the child for a long moment, then looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. What happened next unfolded with terrible efficiency. The warriors searched the cabin, taking what they wanted, tools, blankets, the small amount of food Sarah had preserved for winter. But it was clear they hadn't come just for supplies. When they finished their search, the leader pointed to Sarah and Emma.
"No," Sarah whispered, understanding without words what was being decided.
"Please no." The leader's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught something in his eyes. Not cruelty, but a kind of resignation, as if he was following rules he didn't necessarily like but couldn't change. 2 warriors stepped forward. One reached for Emma, but Sarah pulled her daughter closer. "You can take me," she said desperately, knowing they probably couldn't understand her words but hoping they might understand her tone. "Take me, but please leave her. She's just a baby." The leader tilted his head, studying Sarah's face. For a moment she thought she saw something shift in his expression. Then he barked an order, and the warriors moved. They tied Sarah's hands but left Emma free, perhaps understanding that the child wouldn't run without her mother. As they were led outside, Sarah saw the full extent of what had happened. Her beautiful cabin, the home she and Thomas had built with their own hands, was burning. In the distance she could see smoke from the direction of the fields, and her heart broke completely as she realized that Thomas and James were likely dead. The warriors had horses waiting. Sarah and Emma were lifted onto a painted pony behind one of the younger warriors. As they rode away from everything she had ever known, Sarah looked back once at the ruins of her life. The wildflowers where Emma had been playing just an hour ago were now trampled under hoofprints, and the sheets she had been hanging were scattered and torn. For 3 days they rode west, deeper into Comanche territory than any white woman had ever gone and returned to tell about it. Sarah tried to keep track of their direction, but the endless prairie all looked the same, and soon she was completely lost. Emma clung to her mother, crying at first, then falling into an exhausted silence that worried Sarah more than the tears had. The warriors were not unnecessarily cruel. They shared their water and gave Sarah and Emma strips of dried buffalo meat to eat. But there was no mistaking their situation. They were captives, property to be dealt with according to Comanche law and custom. On the fourth day they reached the village. Sarah had heard stories about Comanche camps, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. It was larger than she had expected, with dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns along a stream. Children ran between the lodges, and women worked over cooking fires or scraped hides stretched on wooden frames. It looked almost peaceful, like any community going about its daily business. But as their small party rode into the center of the village, Sarah became aware of the silence that fell around them. Everyone stopped what they were doing to stare at the white woman and her child. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion or anger. A few of the older women made gestures that Sarah was fairly certain weren't welcoming. The leader, Sarah had heard the others call him Standing Bear, dismounted and began speaking rapidly with an elderly man who had emerged from the largest teepee. This man wore more elaborate clothing than the others, with intricate beadwork and feathers in his hair that marked him as someone important. Chief, Sarah realized. This was the chief. The conversation went on for several minutes, with various other men joining in. Sarah caught some of the looks they sent her way, and her blood ran cold. She had heard the stories of what happened to white women captured by Indians. Some were adopted into the tribe, treated well, and eventually integrated into Comanche society. Others faced a much darker fate. Emma pressed closer to her mother's side. "Mama, I want to go home," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart," Sarah whispered back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just stay close to me, no matter what happens." The debate seemed to be growing more heated. The chief was frowning, and several of the other men were speaking animatedly, their voices rising. Sarah noticed that Standing Bear seemed to be arguing for one position, while most of the others were taking another. She wondered with growing dread what they were deciding. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence. He spoke for a long time, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. When he finished, several of the men nodded, but Standing Bear's expression remained troubled. An older woman approached Sarah and Emma. Her face was weathered by years of sun and wind, but her eyes were kind. She spoke softly in Comanche, then reached out and touched Emma's blonde hair gently. The child shrank back, but the woman smiled and spoke again, her tone soothing. "She's saying you'll be staying with her family," came a voice behind Sarah. She spun around to see a young Indian woman, perhaps 20, who had spoken in accented but clear English. "You speak English?" Sarah gasped. The woman nodded. "I was captured when I was younger than your daughter. My name is Morningstar now, but I was born Rebecca Williams." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening too closely, then stepped closer. "Listen carefully. The chief has decided that you and your daughter will live, but there are conditions. You must work. You must not try to escape, and you must cause no trouble. Some here wanted to..." She paused, searching for words. "Some wanted different justice for the deaths of our warriors in recent raids." Standing Bear spoke for mercy. Sarah's knees felt weak with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me." Morningstar's expression remained serious. "Don't thank me yet. You're alive, but life here won't be easy. Many have lost family to your people. The woman you'll live with, Wind in the Trees, lost her son to cavalry soldiers last spring. She agreed to take you because the chief ordered it, but you'll need to prove yourself worthy of her kindness." Over the following weeks, Sarah began to understand the complex world she had been thrust into. Wind in the Trees was indeed grieving her lost son, but she was also a practical woman who could use help with the many tasks required to maintain a household in Comanche society. Sarah learned to scrape hides, to gather specific plants for medicine and food, to cook buffalo and other game in ways she had never imagined. Emma adapted more quickly than Sarah had expected. Children, it seemed, were more flexible than adults. Within days, she was playing with Comanche children, learning their games and picking up words in their language. Sometimes Sarah would watch her daughter laughing with the other children and feel a complex mix of relief and loss. Relief that Emma was safe and adjusting, loss for the childhood that had been stolen from her. Morningstar became Sarah's lifeline during those early weeks. Born Rebecca Williams in Missouri, she had been captured during a raid 12 years earlier when she was 8 years old. Unlike Sarah, she had been adopted into the tribe as a young child and had genuinely become Comanche in every way that mattered. "I remember my white family sometimes," Morningstar told Sarah one evening as they worked together mending moccasins. "But this is my real family now. These people saved me, raised me, gave me a place in the world." You might find the same thing if you open your heart to it. Sarah struggled with that possibility. Part of her still hoped for rescue, still dreamed that somehow Thomas and James had survived and were looking for her. But as weeks turned to months, those hopes grew fainter. The turning point came during her third month in the village. Sarah had been gathering herbs with wind in the trees when they encountered a hunting party returning from a successful buffalo hunt. The men were celebrating, and the whole village turned out to welcome them back. But something was wrong. Standing Bear, who had been leading the hunt, looked troubled. Through Morningstar, Sarah learned what had happened. The hunting party had encountered a group of white settlers, a family traveling west in a covered wagon. The settlers had been lost, nearly out of water, clearly desperate. Some of the younger warriors had wanted to attack them, but Standing Bear had refused. "He let them go," Morningstar explained quietly. "Gave them water and directions to the nearest fort. But now some of the men are angry with him. They say he's growing soft, that the presence of white captives in our village is making him forget who our real enemies are." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Her presence here wasn't just affecting her own life. It was creating ripples throughout the community, challenging Standing Bear's authority and forcing him to make difficult choices. That evening, as the village settled down for the night, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She sought out Standing Bear's teepee. The warrior was sitting outside his lodge, working on his weapons in the fading light. When he saw Sarah approaching, he looked up with the same unreadable expression he had worn the day he captured her. Sarah had been learning some Comanche words, but her vocabulary was limited. She tried to speak, stumbled, then gestured toward Morningstar, who was following behind her. "Tell him," Sarah said to the younger woman, "that I understand what happened today. Tell him that I'm grateful he showed mercy to my people, even though it cost him something with his own warriors." Morningstar translated, and Standing Bear's expression shifted slightly. He replied in Comanche, his tone measured. "He asks why you would say this," Morningstar translated. "He says you have every reason to hate him. Tell him that I hated him at first. But I've seen how he leads his people, how he tries to do what's right even when it's difficult. Tell him that takes courage, and I respect courage." The translation seemed to surprise Standing Bear.
He studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then spoke again.
"He says you are different than he expected," Morningstar translated. "Most white captives either break completely or remain filled with hatred. You have done neither." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Tell him that I'm trying to understand. I don't know if I can ever truly belong here, but I want to find a way to live with honor among his people." Standing Bear nodded slowly when he heard the translation. Then he did something unexpected. He gestured for Sarah to sit. What followed was the longest conversation Sarah had ever had with her captor. Through Morningstar's translation, Standing Bear told her about the pressures he faced as a war leader in a time of increasing conflict with white settlers. He spoke of the difficult balance between protecting his people and maintaining the honor that was central to Comanche culture. Sarah, in turn, told him about her life before the raid, about Thomas and James, about the dreams she and her husband had shared for their family's future. She spoke of her grief, but also of her growing understanding of the Comanche way of life. As the fire burned low and the conversation wound down, Standing Bear made a statement that Morningstar seemed reluctant to translate.
"What did he say?" Sarah asked.
Morningstar glanced between Sarah and Standing Bear, then sighed. "He said that keeping you alive was one of the hardest decisions he's ever made. Not because he wanted you dead, but because he knew it would change things in the village. He said that sometimes doing the right thing makes everything else more complicated." Sarah looked at Standing Bear with new understanding. "Tell him that I know what that feels like." The next day brought news that would test everyone's convictions. Army scouts had been seen near the village. A patrol was in the area, possibly looking for captured settlers. The village would have to move, and quickly. As the Comanche prepared to break camp, with the efficiency of people who had done this countless times, Sarah faced a moment of terrible choice. During the confusion of packing and moving, escape might be possible. If she could take Emma and slip away during the night, they might be able to find the army patrol. But as she watched Wind in the Trees carefully packing the few belongings that constituted her household, as she saw Morningstar helping organize the move with the competence of someone who truly belonged, as she observed Standing Bear making the difficult decisions that would keep his people safe, Sarah realized that the choice wasn't as simple as she had once thought. This was no longer just about survival. It was about honor, about the promises she had made, and about the person she was choosing to become in the face of impossible circumstances. The moment of decision was approaching, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover what she was truly made of. The opportunity came sooner than Sarah had expected. As the village prepared to move deeper into the wilderness to avoid the army patrol, chaos erupted in the pre-dawn darkness when a storm rolled across the plains with unexpected fury. Lightning split the sky like angry fingers, illuminating the frantic activity as families struggled to secure their belongings against the driving rain. Sarah had been helping Wind in the Trees pack their teepee when a massive gust of wind tore through the camp, scattering supplies and spooking the horses. In the confusion that followed, as men chased loose animals and women fought to save their possessions from the storm, Sarah realized that she and Emma could simply walk into the darkness and disappear. The guards were busy with the emergency, and no one would notice their absence until morning. Emma was pressed against her mother's side, frightened by the storm and the commotion. It would be easy to tell her they were going for a walk, to lead her away from the camp and toward where Sarah hoped the army patrol might be searching. This was the chance she had dreamed of for months. But as Sarah stood in the rain, holding her daughter's hand and watching the Comanche families work together to weather the storm, she found herself paralyzed by doubt. Wind in the Trees was struggling to save her late son's belongings, including a set of hunting arrows that were clearly precious to her. "Dog!" Without thinking, Sarah rushed to help, grabbing the arrows before they could be swept away by the wind. The older woman looked up at Sarah with surprise, then with something that might have been gratitude. In that moment, Sarah saw not an enemy, but a grieving mother trying to preserve the memory of her lost child. "Mama, what are we doing?" Emma asked, shouting to be heard over the wind. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at Wind in the Trees, then toward the darkness beyond the camp where freedom waited. "We're helping," she heard herself say. "We're helping our family." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. When had she started thinking of these people as family? By morning, the storm had passed, but its effects rippled through the village in ways no one had expected. 3 horses had been lost, including Standing Bear's prized war pony. Several teepees had been damaged, and much of their preserved food had been ruined. Most seriously, an elderly woman named Bright Feather had been injured when a falling branch struck her during the height of the storm. Bright Feather was the village's primary medicine woman, keeper of ancient healing knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. As she lay unconscious in her daughter's teepee, the entire community held its breath. Without her guidance, treating the inevitable injuries and illnesses that came with their nomadic life would become much more difficult. It was Morningstar who suggested that Sarah might be able to help. "You mentioned that you helped your husband with injuries on your farm," she said quietly. "You said you knew something about healing." Sarah had indeed learnt basic medical skills during her years on the frontier, where the nearest doctor was often days away. She had set broken bones, stitched wounds, and treated fevers with whatever herbs and remedies were available. But the idea of treating a Comanche medicine woman felt overwhelming. "I don't know their medicines," Sarah protested. "I could make things worse." "Bright Feather is dying," Morningstar said bluntly. "If you do nothing, she dies anyway. At least this way, there's hope." Standing Bear was the one who made the final decision. Despite the protests of some tribal members who didn't trust a white woman to treat their most revered healer, he gave Sarah permission to try. It was another moment when his leadership required him to choose between tradition and pragmatism, and once again he chose to take a risk on mercy. Sarah spent the next 3 days at Bright Feather's bedside. The medicine woman had suffered a severe head injury, and Sarah used every technique she had learned to keep her stable. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, applied poultices made from plants that Morningstar identified as having healing properties, and monitored Bright Feather's condition around the clock. On the 3rd day, the medicine woman opened her eyes. Her recovery was slow, but it was recovery nonetheless. As word spread through the village that the white captive had helped save their medicine woman, something shifted in how the community viewed Sarah. She was no longer just a burden to be tolerated, or a symbol of conflict with the white world. She was someone who had proven her worth through action. Bright Feather herself seemed particularly intrigued by Sarah. Once she was strong enough to sit up, she began asking questions through Morningstar's translation. She wanted to know about white healing practices, about the herbs Sarah's people used, about the differences between their approaches to medicine. "She says you have good hands," Morningstar translated during one of these conversations. "She says the spirits guided you to help her, and she wants to teach you some of our healing ways in return." What followed was an unexpected apprenticeship. As the village continued its journey deeper into Comanche territory, Bright Feather began teaching Sarah about native plants and their uses. Sarah learned to identify dozens of healing herbs, to prepare them properly, and to understand the spiritual aspects of Comanche medicine. It was during this time that Sarah began to truly understand the depth and sophistication of Comanche culture. These weren't the savage raiders that frontier stories portrayed, but people with complex social structures, sophisticated knowledge of their environment, and deep spiritual traditions. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt of the assumptions she had carried about them. Emma, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that both pleased and concerned Sarah. Her daughter was becoming fluent in Comanche, playing eagerly with the other children and adapting to their way of life with the resilience that only children possessed. Sometimes Sarah would watch Emma laughing with her playmates and wonder if her daughter even remembered their old life anymore. The real test of Sarah's place in the community came during their 4th month together, when the village faced a crisis that threatened everyone's survival. A rival band of Kiowa warriors, traditional enemies of this particular Comanche group, had been tracking them for days. The confrontation, when it came, erupted at dawn on a day when most of the Comanche men were away on a hunting expedition. Only a handful of warriors remained in the village, along with the women, children, and elderly. Sarah was gathering water from a stream when she heard the war cries. By the time she ran back to the village, the attack was already underway. Kiowa warriors on horseback were charging through the camp, their weapons flashing in the early morning light. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. She saw Wind in the trees fighting desperately to protect the children in her care. She saw Morningstar wielding a war club with surprising skill. She saw elderly men and teenage boys who were barely old enough to fight standing their ground against seasoned warriors. And she saw Emma, her 6-year-old daughter, hiding behind an overturned travois with 2 other small children, all of them crying in terror. Sarah didn't think. She acted. Grabbing a lance that had fallen from a wounded warrior's hand, Sarah ran toward the children. A Kiowa rider was bearing down on them, his tomahawk raised. Without hesitation, Sarah threw herself between the warrior and the children, raising the lance with both hands. The warrior's horse struck her, sending her tumbling to the ground. But her desperate lunge had spoiled his attack. As he wheeled around for another pass, Standing Bear's voice echoed across the battlefield. The Comanche war leader had returned with his hunting party just in time. The Kiowa, outnumbered and surprised by the return of the Comanche warriors, began to retreat. But not before Sarah saw something that would haunt her dreams. One of the retreating Kiowa warriors had grabbed Emma. The little girl was struggling in the warrior's grip as he tried to lift her onto his horse. Sarah screamed and started running, but she was too far away, and her injured leg couldn't carry her fast enough. That was when Standing Bear did something extraordinary. Instead of pursuing the main group of retreating warriors, he turned his horse toward the Kiowa who had Emma. What followed was a chase across the prairie that seemed to last forever, but probably took only minutes. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as Standing Bear gradually closed the distance. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and decisive. Standing Bear was a veteran warrior in his prime, and the Kiowa warrior, burdened by Emma's weight and his horse's fatigue, was at a disadvantage. In a fight that was over almost before it began, Standing Bear rescued Emma and sent the Kiowa warrior fleeing into the distance. When he returned to the village with Emma safe in his arms, the little girl was crying for a mother, but she was also saying something else, something that made several of the Comanche women smile through their tears. She was saying thank you in perfect Comanche. That evening, as the village tended to its wounded and mourned its dead, Sarah found herself sitting once again outside Standing Bear's teepee. This time, she didn't need Morningstar to translate everything. Her Comanche was still limited, but she could express basic ideas. "You saved my daughter," she said haltingly in his language. Standing Bear nodded. "She is one of us now," he replied simply. The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. Emma was one of them. And increasingly, Sarah realized so was she. The attack had clarified something that had been building for months. During the battle, Sarah hadn't thought about escaping or reaching the army. She had thought only about protecting the children of the village, including her own daughter, but not exclusively her daughter. She had fought to defend people she had once considered her enemies. Standing Bear seemed to understand her internal struggle. "You fought well today," he said. "Many saw your courage." "I was afraid," Sarah admitted. "Good warriors are always afraid," Standing Bear replied. "Fear keeps you alive, but you didn't let fear stop you from doing what was right." They sat in silence for a while, watching the activities of the village as families rebuilt and recovered from the day's trauma. Finally, Standing Bear spoke again. "The hunting party saw army soldiers today," he said quietly. "They are getting closer. Soon we will have to decide what to do." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind of decision?" Standing Bear looked at her directly. "Whether to fight them, run from them, or try to talk with them. And what to do with our white captives if they catch up to us." The implications were clear. If the army was closing in, the village would soon face choices that could determine everyone's fate. And Sarah's presence, along with Emma's, would complicate those choices enormously. "What do you think we should do?" Sarah asked, surprised by her own use of the word we. Standing Bear smiled slightly at her unconscious choice of pronouns. "I think," he said slowly, "that the spirits have put you here for a reason. Perhaps to help us find a path that doesn't end in more bloodshed." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a simple frontier wife with dreams of a peaceful life. Now she was a Comanche captive who had fought to defend her captor's children and was being asked to help negotiate with her own people. The woman she had been wouldn't have understood, the woman she was becoming. But as she listened to Emma sleeping peacefully beside her, speaking occasionally in Comanche even in her dreams, Sarah realized that understanding might be overrated. Sometimes you had to trust that you were on the right path, even when you couldn't see where it was leading. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the approaching army patrol would force decisions that none of them wanted to make. But tonight, in the quiet of Wind in the Trees TPE, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the day of her capture. She felt like she belonged somewhere. The question was whether that belonging could survive what was coming next. The army patrol found them 2 days later, just as Standing Bear had predicted. Sarah was helping Brightfeather prepare medicines when the scouts' warning cry echoed across the camp. Blue coats on the horizon, riding hard in their direction. The soldiers had finally caught up. What followed was controlled chaos, as the village prepared for what might be their final confrontation. Warriors checked their weapons. Women gathered the children, and the elderly began the familiar ritual of preparing for either battle or flight. But this time was different. This time they had Sarah. Standing Bear called a hasty council of war chiefs and senior warriors. Sarah wasn't invited, but she could see the heated discussion taking place outside the chief's lodge. Gestures toward her position, raised voices, the kind of urgent debate that preceded life-changing decisions. Morning Star appeared at Sarah's side, her face grim. "They're arguing about what to do with you and Emma when the soldiers arrive," she said quietly. "Some want to use you as shields. Others want to kill you rather than let you be rescued and tell the army about our location and numbers." Sarah felt ice in her veins. After everything they had been through together, after the relationship she had built and the trust she had earned, it might all end in violence after all.
"What does Standing Bear want to do?" Sarah asked.
Morningstar glanced toward the council, then back at Sarah. "He wants to try something that's never been done before. He wants to negotiate." The idea was revolutionary. Comanche bands didn't negotiate with army patrols. They fought them, or they ran from them, or they avoided them entirely. But Standing Bear was proposing to use Sarah as something unprecedented. A bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. The plan, as Morningstar explained it, was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. Standing Bear would approach the army patrol under a white flag, bringing Sarah with him as proof of good faith. Sarah would then act as translator and intermediary, helping both sides find a way to resolve the situation without bloodshed. "But why would he risk that?" Sarah asked. "He could just let them take Emma and me. It would solve his problem." Morningstar smiled sadly. "You still don't understand him, do you? Standing Bear doesn't see problems. He sees people, and he's decided that you and Emma are his people now, just as much as any Comanche in this village." The decision to attempt negotiation wasn't unanimous. Several warriors argued vehemently against it, pointing out that trusting white soldiers was foolishness that could get them all killed. But Standing Bear's authority held, and his vision of a different kind of solution prevailed. As the army patrol approached, Sarah found herself in the surreal position of preparing to meet her own people as an advocate for her former captors. She braided her hair in the Comanche style that Wind in the Trees had taught her, put on the decorated deerskin dress that the women had made for her, and tried to prepare mentally for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Emma would stay with Wind in the Trees, safely back from the meeting point. If things went wrong, Sarah wanted her daughter to have the best chance of survival, even if that meant growing up Comanche. The meeting took place in a clearing between two hills, with both sides maintaining careful distance while their leaders approached under the universally understood symbol of truce. Captain William Morrison, commanding officer of the patrol, was a weathered man in his 50s whose surprised expression suggested he hadn't expected to encounter a white woman dressed as an Indian speaking on behalf of Comanche warriors. "Mrs.?" he began, clearly struggling to process the situation. "Mitchell," Sarah replied. "Sarah Mitchell. I was captured 6 months ago from a homestead outside Fort Worth." Captain Morrison's demeanor shifted immediately. "Thank God," he said with obvious relief. "We've been looking for you. Your husband survived the attack, ma'am. He's been organizing search parties ever since." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas was alive. Her husband, whom she had mourned for months, had survived and was looking for her. The life she had thought was destroyed forever was still there, waiting for her return. Standing Bear, who had been watching this exchange with careful attention, spoke quietly to Sarah in Comanche. She translated automatically. "He asks if you want to go back to your old life now." Captain Morrison looked between Sarah and Standing Bear with growing confusion. "Ma'am, you don't need to translate for him. You're safe now. We're here to take you home." But Sarah found herself hesitating. Home. The word that had once meant everything to her now carried complications she couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. Home to Thomas, yes, but also away from Wind in the Trees, who had become like a mother to her. Away from Bright Feather, who had taught her healing skills she never could have learned in the white world. Away from Emma's playmates and the community that had accepted them both. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said slowly, "before we proceed, I need to explain something to you about these people." What followed was a conversation unlike any that had taken place between army officers and Comanche warriors in the recorded history of the frontier. With Sarah serving as translator and advocate, both sides began to understand each other in ways that had never been possible before. Standing Bear spoke of his people's need to protect their traditional hunting grounds, of the pressure they felt from increasing white settlement, of their willingness to coexist if boundaries could be respected. Captain Morrison talked about his orders to protect settlers, about the political pressures from Washington to pacify the frontier, about his own desire to find solutions that didn't require constant warfare. Slowly, incredibly, the outline of an agreement began to emerge. The Comanche would release their white captives and agree to avoid certain territories that had been marked for settlement. In return, the army would establish specific boundaries for Comanche lands and would prosecute white settlers who violated those boundaries. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning. The negotiation took hours, with breaks for both sides to consult with their respective groups. During one of these breaks, Standing Bear asked Sarah the question she had been dreading. When this is over, he said through Morningstar's translation, "What will you choose, your old life or your new one?" Sarah looked toward the hill where she could see Emma playing with the other children, laughing at some game that transcended cultural boundaries. She thought of Thomas, alive and searching for her, carrying grief she could help heal. She thought of Wind in the Trees, who had lost one child and gained another. She thought of Morningstar, who had navigated this same impossible choice years ago and found her own answer. "I want to try something different," Sarah said finally. "I want to see if there's a way to honor both." What Sarah proposed was radical beyond anything either side had considered. Instead of simply returning to her old life, she wanted to serve as a permanent liaison between the white and Comanche communities. She would live part of the time with Thomas at their rebuilt homestead, and part of the time with Standing Bear's band, helping to maintain the fragile peace they were trying to build. Emma, she suggested, should be allowed to choose for herself when she was old enough to understand the implications. Until then, she would spend time in both worlds, learning both languages, understanding both cultures. Captain Morrison was skeptical. "Mrs. Mitchell, with respect, what you're proposing is unprecedented. I'm not sure my superiors would approve of a white woman living among hostile Indians." "They're not hostile," Sarah replied firmly. "They're people trying to protect their families and their way of life, just like we are. And if we want this peace to last, someone needs to help both sides understand each other." Standing Bear's response when he heard the translation surprised everyone. He smiled, the first time Sarah had seen him genuinely smile since the day they met. "He says," Morningstar translated, "that you have become what he hoped you would become, a bridge between worlds." The final agreement was more complex than anyone had anticipated, but it held promise that neither side had dared to hope for. The Comanche would release Sarah and Emma, but Sarah would return voluntarily as a cultural ambassador. Emma would be educated in both communities, Standing Bear's band would relocate to specified territories where they could maintain their traditional lifestyle without conflict with settlers. Most importantly, both sides would meet regularly to resolve disputes peacefully rather than through violence. As the negotiations concluded and both groups prepared to part ways, Sarah faced the emotional challenge of saying goodbye to people who had become family. Wind in the trees wept openly as she embraced Sarah, pressing a small pouch of healing herbs into her hands. She says, Morningstar translated through her own tears, that you gave her back a reason to live when you helped save Bright Feather. She says you will always be her daughter, no matter where you go. Bright Feather presented Sarah with a sacred medicine bundle, marking her as a recognized healer in Comanche tradition. She says the spirits brought you to us for a purpose, Morningstar explained. That purpose isn't finished yet. Even the children had gathered to say goodbye, including Emma's playmates, who had taught her to braid grass into dolls and to track animals through the forest. Emma hugged each of them, promising in her mixture of English and Comanche that she would see them again soon. Standing Bear's farewell was characteristically understated but deeply felt. You came to us as a captive, he said through Morningstar's translation. You leave as a sister. The path ahead will be difficult, but you have shown that it is possible to find honor in both worlds. As Sarah rode away with the army patrol, Emma sitting beside her on Captain Morrison's horse, she turned back once to wave at the people who had been her family for 6 months. They stood in a line watching her go. Standing Bear, tall and dignified, wind in the trees wiping away tears. Bright Feather raising a gnarled hand in blessing. Morning Star already planning for Sarah's promised return. The reunion with Thomas was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and nothing like she had expected. Her husband wept when he saw her, holding her as if he would never let her go again. But the woman he held was not the same woman who had been captured 6 months earlier, and both of them knew it. You look different, Thomas said as they sat in the rebuilt cabin that evening, Emma asleep between them. I am different, Sarah replied honestly. I've seen things, learned things, done things I never imagined possible. Thomas studied her face in the firelight. Do you regret it? Any of it? Sarah considered the question carefully. Did she regret the loss of innocence, the terror of capture, the months of uncertainty? Did she regret learning that the world was more complicated than she had believed, that enemies could become family and that peace required understanding rather than just victory? No, she said finally. I don't regret it. It nearly destroyed me, but it also made me into someone I'm proud to be. Over the following months, as Sarah began her unprecedented role as intermediary between the communities, she discovered that the most difficult part wasn't navigating between two cultures, it was explaining to each side that the other was worthy of respect. Many whites couldn't understand why she would voluntarily return to spend time with savages. Many Comanche couldn't understand why she would choose the constrained life of white society over the freedom of the plains. But gradually, through patient explanation and living example, Sarah began to build the bridges that would make lasting peace possible. Emma thrived in her dual life, becoming fluent in both languages and comfortable in both cultures. She learned mathematics and reading from white teachers, tracking and horsemanship from Comanche instructors. By the time she was 10, she could serve as translator herself, and she often accompanied Sarah on diplomatic missions between the communities. Standing Bear kept his word about maintaining peace, and his band became a model for successful coexistence. Other Comanche leaders began to seek out Sarah's advice when conflicts arose with white settlers. Army officers started requesting her mediation when negotiations seemed deadlocked. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 2 years after her return, when Standing Bear himself visited Sarah's rebuilt homestead. Thomas welcomed him with the hospitality due to an honored guest, and the two men, who had every reason to be enemies, found common ground in their shared respect for Sarah and their mutual desire to protect their families. As they sat on Sarah's porch that evening, watching Emma play with children from both communities, Standing Bear made an observation that captured the essence of what they had all accomplished. When I captured you, he said through Sarah's translation, I thought I was taking an enemy who would become property. Instead, I found a teacher who showed us a different way to live. Thomas, who had struggled with forgiveness but had gradually come to understand his wife's perspective, nodded slowly. She has that effect on people, he said. Sarah sees possibilities where the rest of us see only problems. Sarah smiled as she translated between the two men who had shaped her life in such different ways. Neither of them would ever fully understand the other's world, but they didn't need to. They only needed to understand that both worlds had value, and that peace was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity rather than their differences. The little girl who had been captured on a Texas prairie 6 years earlier had grown into a young woman who belonged fully to neither world and yet was essential to both. Emma Mitchell had become something new, a bridge between cultures, a living symbol of the possibility that enemies could become family, and that understanding could triumph over fear. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. She thought of the moment when she had knelt in the dirt with her hands bound, certain that her life was over. She thought of the impossible choice Standing Bear had made when she begged for mercy, and the even more impossible choices that had followed. Most of all, she thought about the power of seeing beyond the surface of things, of recognizing that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest tragedies, and that hope can flourish in the most unlikely soil. The frontier was still a dangerous place, and the peace they had built was fragile and constantly threatened by those on both sides who preferred the certainty of hatred to the difficulty of understanding. But it was also a place where a Comanche warrior could choose mercy over vengeance, where a white woman could find family among former enemies, and where a small girl could grow up speaking two languages and knowing that both cultures were part of her heritage. In the end, that was perhaps the most impossible thing of all. That love could grow from the ashes of hatred, that understanding could emerge from the depths of fear, and that the choice to see others as human beings rather than enemies could change the world, one relationship at a time. The story that began with a plea for mercy had become something much larger, a testament to the power of choosing compassion over revenge, understanding over ignorance, and hope over despair. It was a story that would be told around campfires for generations to come, not as a tale of capture and rescue, but as a chronicle of transformation and the triumph of the human spirit over the forces that seek to divide us. Sarah Mitchell had asked for mercy and received something far greater. She had discovered that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, the impossible choice to extend grace to our enemies can open doors to futures we never imagined possible.